And now for the latest on Ukraine, Andrew Peak joins me now live from Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thanks very much, Andrew, for joining us here on TRT World. Now, you heard what our correspondent Dasha said. President Putin has announced that there will be no more mobilization in Russia. Does that possibly indicate that this war is coming to an end?
Well, I think it indicates that Putin is expecting the next 5 to 6 months of winter to be the period when it's most likely that the war ends. This is why he has been knocking out Ukraine's energy infrastructure. This is why he has been putting the squeeze on energy supplies to Europe and elsewhere. He wants the political pressure to mount, to rise high enough in Ukraine and among Ukraine's backers that some kind of truce, some kind of ceasefire like the Minsk agreements is agreed to. I think he has confidence that the chances of getting a ceasefire in the next half year are higher than they have been since February.
And Andrew, you know what's mind-boggling here is the fact that on Thursday, Russia took aim at the southern Ukrainian region of Kherson, the very region it recently abandoned from. What could possibly explain Russia's attacks on Kherson now?
I agree. It's extremely puzzling. It is either a couple of options jump to mind. It is laying waste to Kherson such that it cannot be used effectively to generate resources for Ukraine, that it can't be used to mobilize troops and conduct a further military operation, perhaps into Crimea. Which has to be one of Putin's key red lines. You remember back in 2014, in February, it was the threat to Crimea, the perceived threat with the changeover in government in Ukraine that led to Putin initiating this war in the first place, putting troops without insignia on their uniforms into Crimea to preserve the naval base. So what I would suspect is it is some kind of delaying tactic used to forestall an advance into Crimea, which would be Putin's most valued goal in all of Ukraine.
Right. And Andrew, before I let you go, what do you think is Russia's military strategy now? Remember when the so-called military operation began back in February, we were hearing reports about Russia's attacks on Ukraine as far west as Lviv. But lately, these attacks have been limited mostly to the eastern part of Ukraine. We do hear from time to time reports of attacks on Kiev. So how would you navigate through Russia's military strategy in Ukraine right now?
Well, it's really interesting. You know, Russia thinks of military operations as full spectrum. You saw Putin in one of your clips just a moment ago talking about information war with the mothers, with the grieving mothers of fallen Russian soldiers, talking about that information can be a weapon. Russia thinks of the military as one piece of an overall geopolitical strategy. And indeed, it pioneered use of information in certain earlier conflicts. What I would suspect is the next 6 months, Russia's strategy is to play up the image of being willing to settle for a ceasefire, to increase the costs, the perceived cost to the rest of Europe of not accepting Russia's terms, a ceasefire with Russian forces in place in Ukraine, and using its military to make tactical advances for the Ukrainians as costly as they can. So it's a stalling technique, broadly speaking, across political, information, military, and other forms of warfare.
Andrew Peak, thank you very much for talking to us here on TRT World. Really appreciate your taking out the time.